I have to say that just speaking about our military, it conjures up in me just this overwhelming pride and thankfulness. Part because I know so many people who served, but most selfishly, thank you, son, because my brother serves currently. And every so often he gets pulled into harm's way, and I have concern for him. He's my little brother. Today, we're going to be talking about chapter 6 in the story. And if you've done your reading, you know that we're going to talk about wandering. And as I went through this reading, I started to think about this is essentially a nation on a road trip. Before there was a road, they were making a road in the wilderness. And when I started to think about road trips, I thought about worst road trips that I've ever been on. I've had the privilege of going on several road trips with my involvement in the district youth. And some of those have been crazy, wild, and fun, and some of those would get on the level of worst road trip ever. But none of them compare to where I was approximately 365 days ago, before I spoke with the first time in this church. Some of you may not know this story, and so I'm going to share in brief what happened the 7 days before I arrived here to preach the first time, to candidate before you. I took a group of 60 middle school students to Washington, D.C. in a bus. 7 days before I came here, I had embarked on this trip. And I was the driver for the bus. I have a CDL, so sometimes I get asked to do these kind of things. And so we left out of Orlando for Washington, D.C. And everything was smooth for approximately 20 hours. Yeah, 20 hours of driving. Everything's approximately good to this point. And something happens with the bus. It just begins to lose power. And I pull off the side of the road, not knowing what has gone wrong. I'm not a diesel mechanic. Matter of fact, I'm not a mechanic at all. And I have no idea what we're going to do. What I know is it's almost midnight. It's very dark. And we're on the outer ring of Washington, D.C., where I have no friends. Not a single person I can call on. So I do a Google search on my phone. Roadside mechanic. And evacuation buses. We evacuated the teenagers, middle school students. You know how forgiving middle school students are when things go wrong. Yeah, 0. They're not forgiving at all. Mr. Harmison, did you break the bus? Yes, that was my intent, to break the bus. Clearly, I want to sit here the rest of the night on the side of the road. So we evacuate them, and they go to the hotel, and they check in, and my co-driver says he will stay with the bus so that I can go with the teenagers. How giving, how forgiving of him to allow this to happen. So we get the teenagers checked into the hotel, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, my co-driver calls me and says, "We're on our way." They manufactured a part on the side of the road to fix the bus. This seems like great news. The bus is fixed. At 7 a.m., we have to leave the hotel to begin the first part of the tour in D.C. So think about your sleep cycles. We have to load all these students into the bus by 7 a.m., and we got the bus fixed at 5 a.m. This is day 1 of this trip. So we have a good time, and for 6 days we tour Washington, D.C. No problems, no deals with the bus. We're in good shape. So Friday night, in the middle of the night, we start to head home. Our plan is to get home Saturday morning. I'm to be here Sunday morning. No problem. We have 24 hours between arrival time back in Orlando before I needed to be here. No problem. This is a great plan. This isn't going to be an issue. We get to the North Carolina-South Carolina border, and the bus breaks down again. The exact same part broke, the part they had manufactured on the side of the road. For 9 hours we sat on the side of the road, because as you remember, it was a holiday weekend. There was no parts to be had. So we waited, and we waited, and we waited. And finally, the administrator from the school that I was driving for, the principal, he called and he chartered another bus to come pick us up. And so we arrived home in Orlando at 2 o'clock in the morning on Sunday morning. Rebecca picked me up, and at 5 in the morning, we left to come here to preach my first message in front of you. This categorized as worst road trip ever. But let me tell you what I learned in that road trip. See, I had the opportunity to meet and bond with the group of chaperones that were on this field trip. And on Saturday, when we were on the side of the road, we stood there as a group of parents, as a group of Christians, as a group of people who had become basically family over the course of 6 days. That happens when you eat, drink, tour, and sleep with a group of people for 7 days. You become bonded in a special way. We stood on the side of the road and we prayed, and the assistant football coach of the school comes over to me, and he's a big burly guy. He's about this tall and about that wide. He comes over with his hand that I can only describe as a meat hook. It was huge, and he pounds me on the shoulder and he says, "Brother, you're going to get to that church to preach. God's got a plan." To have a football coach come and pray with you with conviction, with power. And since then, he contacts me semi-regularly. How are things going? We miss you here, but we're glad you're doing what God's called you to do. See, worst road trip ever? Yes. Lifetime bonds? Even better. I'll take that. And this is what we're talking about with the Israelites. That they're touring, if you will, the wilderness. They're looking at the destination. And many of us, we're guilty of the same thing. We begin to look at the destination and we miss the process of how we get there. The destination becomes so important that we miss what the journey teaches us along the way. The journey is there to teach us not about how to manufacture a road trip, but to take a trip that should have only lasted this amount of time and learn this lesson, to gain this knowledge, to be able to say at the end of the day that this was all worth it, that this was all in God's plan. See, we have to remember that the journey of the Israelites started with God giving them the law and the promise of his presence, the provision for sin, and then a cloud and fire to guide them. See, a lot of my friends like to say that the Israelites were lost in the wilderness. What was really happening, though, was that God was guiding them and teaching them everything they needed to learn along the way. Read with me, if you will, Numbers chapter 9, verse 15. On the day the tabernacle, the tent of the covenant law was set up, the cloud covered it. From evening till morning, the cloud above the tabernacle looked like fire. That is how it continued to be. The cloud covered it, and at night it looked like fire. Whenever the cloud lifted from above the tent, the Israelites set out. Whenever the cloud settled, the Israelites encamped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. Wouldn't we all really appreciate a cloud and a pillar of fire to guide us where God wants us to go? Wouldn't that be a great way to know that we were following God, in theory? But remember, God was leading them around, teaching them a lesson because of how hard-headed they were, because of how much they complained. See, by now, the Israelites have found themselves in the land between the destination. The land between is a great place to be. See, this is not a random journey through the wilderness. This journey is God leading them and us with intentionality on where he wanted them and us to go. See, God takes the Israelites through the wilderness to teach them to trust him. We don't learn trust in paradise. We learn it in the wilderness. Have any of you experienced God's provision just falling over you and just everything seeming to go your way and everything seems right with the world? I would be willing to believe that in a room this size, many of you have seen this happen in your life at one point or another. You didn't learn to trust God when everything was going right. See, when I learned to trust God is when everything was going wrong and it still turned out all right. When everything didn't go on my plan and I was able to realize that it was going on his plan. When his perfect will was being played out, that's when I learned to trust God. Not when everything was going perfect. When everything's going perfect, I tend to turn my back and look the other way and not look towards God. That's exactly what the Israelites had, is that they were learning to trust God. God takes the Israelites through the wilderness to teach them to trust him more. See, if God was going to use this nation to bless the entire world, they had to trust him. They had to trust him completely, not just for the journey, but what life would look like at the end of the journey, in the destination. When they reach the promised land, would they still trust God? Because if we reach the destination, if we walk through the entire journey and we get to the end of it and we don't trust God, guess what happens? We have to go back over to the beginning and start completely over. Well, I'd be willing to say that none of us want to start over and go back to where we were before we learned to trust God. But that's exactly what happens to the nation of Israel. They had to go back and go back and go back. They didn't learn the lesson. I tell you, don't be hard on the Israelites because they were doing what we do. They were walking around in circles, not listening to God, doing things their own way, getting their own priorities in place. And what does God do? He doses out a little bit of justice, a little bit of punishment, a little bit of order. It's what any parent does. Well, let me rephrase that. It's what any good parent does. Because there's lots of parents that I've seen that will let their kids run amok in the grocery store. Having worked many years in the grocery store, I've seen this more than I care to admit. And there are many parents who will let that happen. And when little Johnny doesn't get what he expects to get at the store and has a complete meltdown, and mom puts him in the cart and just walks around like she doesn't hear that. Rebecca used to call it mom ears. And you don't hear what the child is doing. You just let that go. But what any good parent does is they correct and redirect their child. And this is at times easier said than done. Now, this passage that I've put up on the screen for you, I've used this many, many times. I would be willing to bet that Rebecca could give you this passage off the top of her head because we've used it in our house to show how we should order our life to make sure that we live a healthy-ish life. Let me read it for you. They disciplined us for a while as they thought best. But God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in His holiness. And here it is. My children can give you this one. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. We don't like to hear that when we're going through discipline. It's a lot better to hear that passage of Scripture after God's done disciplining us. But this is what He does to the Israelites as they learn that God is raising adults in spirituality. Let me read for you this quote. We tend to forget that we are not raising children. We are raising adults. My job as a dad is much more difficult than simply ensuring that I have compliant children. My task is to raise adults who will not act as if they are the center of the universe. Left to themselves, self-centered children have a way of becoming narcissistic employees, husbands, and wives. The goal of discipline is to correct behavior early while the stakes are low, as with the tantrum in the checkout lane. But stakes keep raising as a child grows, as they date, as they marry, as they produce offspring. The life marked by self-centeredness can result in a nasty toll on a person's sphere of influence expanding. These are harsh words, but they're true. It's our job as a parent, as a grandparent, as an aunt, as an uncle, to make sure that the children around us understand that they're not the center of the universe. And that this flies directly in the face of what children in today's society are told. Let me show you something. Samantha, give me your cell phone, please. Ian, can I have yours too? Just sit it up here. Isn't that fun? You know what happens when I do this in our house? I get eye-to-eye contact with my children. See, sometimes we have to do that. We have to take away all of the distractions so that we can interact with each other. This is what God does to us occasionally, and this is what He does to the Israelites. He takes away all of their distractions and says, here I am. Worship me. Look at me. Talk to me. See, we miss that God's raising us to be Him-centered instead of us-centered. It's much easier for all of us to be self-centered because that comes natural. But God doesn't want that from us. He wants Him-centered. Take a look here at what happens as children need discipline. You guys can have your phones back if you want them. I was just stealing them for a second. Look how quick they want those back. Look here, this is from the upper story. Now, we've talked about what it means when they're wandering the wilderness, but look what happens here from God's point of view. They complained about the general hardships of the wilderness, so God sent fire. Have you done this with your children? Oh, this isn't difficult enough for you? Let me show you what difficult life looks like. Lately, I've shared with the kids what it meant when we had only dial-up instead of high-speed internet. Oh, the horrors. And then we showed them, what if all digital media goes away and you have to pick up a book with pages and words? Terrible. When we complain about the hardships, God's got an answer for that. He sent fire. I like to think of this as catching your kids smoking and then sitting on the porch with them and let them smoke the whole pack of cigarettes. Kind of cures that. Oh, you want to complain? Let me show you some fire. This is what I think God's doing here. Look at the next one. They complained about the boring manna that God provided for food, and after providing quail, he sent a plague. Oh, that's right. In the wilderness where there's no food or no water, and I sent you manna and quail, and you want to complain. Here's a plague. It's an interesting way of dealing with your children. So they complained again about food and water. God sent them venomous snakes. How about that? That should make them done complaining. You would think, right? You would think. But look, the story goes on. I'm only showing you 6 of the 10 of these. The spies come back from the promised land and say, I don't think that we should go in there. And God sends them 40 years. Oh, you don't want to go in there? Okay. How about 40 years? Take another lap around the mountain. 40 more years style. Take another lap. And then the people complained about the lack of water, and they got so bad with their complaining that Moses gets angry, and he hits the rock instead of speaking to it as God told him. And they get water, but Moses doesn't get to go to the promised land. Now, I believe that Moses was overwhelmed with the battle of being a leader, that if you have the opportunity to be the leader of a group of people that are following God, such as a church, let me tell you, let me pull the veil back a little bit and let you see what happens behind the scenes. Now, don't misunderstand me. I appreciate all of your comments and all of your suggestions, but some of them can only be classified as complaints. Comments and suggestions are welcomed. Complaints, I don't really need that kind of negativity in my life. Let me tell you what happens, is that complaints are kind of filed away in maybe you should think more about God instead of about what you're complaining about. Suggestions are filed in the maybe God's using you to speak truth into the life of what should go on in the church. There's a big difference in the way those are delivered and a big difference in the way those are received. What Moses was receiving was a constant barrage of complaints. There's no food, there's no water. Oh, we have food, but it's manna again. What's manna? God providing. Oh, if God wouldn't provide manna, we could eat good. Oh, we have venomous snakes because we complained about the water and the food. Great. Can we get some fresh water, Moses? How about some fresh water? And Moses loses it. You stick around the pastor of the church long enough and you hear enough of the complaints, you will lose it too. I promise you. It's not for the weak at heart to listen to the number of complaints that come through the office. Not here. Know that I'm not talking about you. None of you, because none of you would complain. A few of you got that. Moses reaches that point. He's heard too much, and he hits the rock. There's your water. You want water? Here it is. But it cost Moses everything that he dreamed of, everything that God had promised him. That's the danger from the pastor's side. That you would hear the complaints of the people and become so frustrated with it that you lose what God has promised you. This is the balance. I have a friend who's no longer in ministry that says to me when I first started to follow this path, he said, ministry is great, except for all the people. And at times, I've seen that to be true. So I don't give Moses a hard time here. Now, towards the end of their journey, look what the people did. They intermingled with other people. Specifically what God had told them not to do. And began to worship false gods. They ate the meat of the sacrifices. They participated in the process of worshiping false gods. The reward for this? Another plague. Good times, right? Another plague. You would think they would have gotten this. Remember how Moses described the people that he was leading to God? Do you remember this? These stiff-necked people that you gave me. See, when people show a lack of trust in God, God responds every time with discipline. See, just before they entered the promised land, God tells them everything that's going to happen. He wanted them to make a connection between their heart and love and the love of life that God has provided. He's begging them to choose life instead of lust. See, we miss a lot of times that we have to choose to be blessed. I'm talking about a prosperity gospel. If that's what you're thinking, you can just turn that off because that's not what I'm talking about here today. Follow this scenario with me. If I find out that there is a lady that every day, every Sunday in front of Publix, she stands there from 1 o'clock in the afternoon till 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and she hands out $20 bills to everybody who comes in. Which Publix is that? Exactly. Now, we didn't rehearse that. That's the perfect question. We want to share that information, but what do we want to do more than anything else is we want to be in position to receive that blessing. Knowing that there's someone that's giving away money, we need to be where they are to receive that blessing. It's no different in God's kingdom that when God is working, when He is doing something, we need to be located where that blessing is happening. That's not always a location. Many times it's a state of mind. We need to be in a thankful posture, in a readiness to be blessed. See, most of the time we spend our life, our energy, our efforts complaining instead of praising. It's much easier to complain than it is to be thankful. See, we in our family, we have a rule that we're not allowed to complain during the winter time when it's cold. And as a reverse of that, in the summertime, when it's hot as the face of the sun, we don't complain about that either. Instead, Ian started it. He said, the source of all life seems to be working very well today. The sun. The sun seems to be working really well today. That's his way of saying, it's blazing hot out here. See, we turn that into a praise, to a thankfulness, to looking at how blessed we are to have the opportunity to live on a planet that is just the right amount of distance away from a burning, blazing sun, and that as a result of the tilt of the axis of the earth, we are just the right angle to receive that heat, but it not be so much that we're burnt to a crisp and not so little that we freeze. That it's just right. What a blessing. See, it's easy to complain about the weather, but let's take that and look at it in how fortunate we are to live just the right distance away, at just the right tilt, to just sustain life. If you think evolution, when you start to think through that science, you'll quickly realize there's no way that that happens by chance. It's impossible. There's no way that all of these things happen just so and not be by design. We need to choose praise over pleasure. The Israelites wandered through the wilderness and they grumbled about what the wilderness was like. How awful that they forgot what they had been set free from to wander in the wilderness. I think about this and I think they complained and they complained and they complained and they longed for the good old days. The good old days when they were slaves and they were told what to do and what to eat and when to wake up and when to go to sleep, and every part of their life was completely planned out for them and controlled by someone who didn't care if they lived or died. And they traded all of that for the freedom that God provided and the provision that He gave. And their response was to grumble and complain. I feel compelled to tell you today that the good old days are not as good as you remember. You only remember the good parts. There's grief, there's strife, there's anguish that goes into everything that you look back on and say, the good old days. You just don't remember it. You don't remember the price that was paid for you to be able to look back at the good old days and remember that they were the good old days. You lose sight of how good these days are in the strife and the struggle, and you don't realize that when you get another 15 or 20 years from this point and you look back and you go, remember where the good old days when, and they're no different. But today, they're a struggle and something to complain about. In 10 years, they're the good old days. You see that correlation there? This thing that happens when we look back with our rose-colored glasses and we remember the good old days. It's just not true. There was a struggle that went along with that. See, Satan tempts us to take us down. But God tests us to build us up. They look very similar. God's test builds us up, makes us stronger, makes us able to take the fight even further. And we miss that many times as we go through it. This is why we have to choose faith over fear. Fear is always bad. Let me say that again. Fear is always bad. Phil Lewis at Park Place gave me an acronym for fear 15 years ago. And it's stuck in my head so much that I can't let it go. Every time I feel like I can't do something, I'm reminded of this fear acronym. Take the word fear and write it down the edge of your page in that blank space that you have there. And then take and write false evidence appearing real. What makes you afraid is false evidence appearing real. If we make our decision based on false evidence, we can only make bad decisions. If we make our decisions based on good evidence, we can only make good decisions. Watch how this happens as we prepare to pray over our next steps. See, when Rebecca and I began to pray for what we believed God was leading us to at this church, we began to pray over the worship, over the youth. And God told us very clearly and very plainly not to worry about these things, that He was going to send one person to handle both. And we said, woohoo! Like, oh, good. And then later on, God told me that person would come from Southern Wesleyan University. And I said, well, good, I know a lot of people there. And I thought, I really did think, and I never told anybody but Rebecca this, I thought Samantha was that answer. And I was like, oh, man, we've got to wait 3 more years. Come on, God. We really were hoping to do that a little sooner, and we thought the vision you gave us was faster. And then Shannon called me. And he said, I'm thinking about moving. I'm thinking about what my ministry looks like. And I shared with him, and we sat down and we walked around the building, and it became very apparent fast that this was the place for him, that this was the answer that God was leading us to. Shannon wasn't on my radar. Shannon was a friend who I talked to occasionally. And then God revealed the answer. This is what faith looks like. We get the answer from God, and we have to hold and wait for His time. Now, there will be many people, and I don't mean any of you, I mean the people when they come back from up north. When they get here in October and they hear this rock band with the guitar and the drums and where's the piano, and they grumble about the worship style, and look at all these kids, we got half the church filled with teenagers. When they grumble and complain about that, because that's what I believe will happen, it'll be our responsibility, the core of the church, those of you sitting here now that watch the progression as God works out His plan, that say, yeah, isn't it great? When they complain, you can look at them and say, yeah, it's not the good old days, it's better. Look what God's doing. Because that's what I believe He's leading us to. And we need to begin to prepare our spirit for that. That when those in our midst begin to grumble and complain, we're reminded we don't want to be like the Israelites. God has given us a cloud to follow. He's given us a promise, and we're walking towards it one step at a time, one little bit at a time, knowing that He has a plan and a purpose for everything that we're doing and everything that we're going through. I believe that this is just the first step. And there will be things along the way that will become increasingly more uncomfortable. Great news, huh? Yeah. More uncomfortable? Yay! But you know what? I want to be uncomfortable and weird and out of all of it as long as I'm following what God is telling me to do. And I believe all of you want that too. So I'm kind of preaching to the choir. I want you to understand that in the coming weeks, when we tell you things that sound even more strange than this, that you'll be prepared. That you'll say, I don't see it, but I know that God has a plan and a purpose. That you will be on board and ready to jump through whatever God is calling us to. I've eliminated fear out of my life and replaced it with faith. I'm encouraging you to do the same. Because there's a dangerous reality that happens when you begin to look around and say, I don't care what I see, what the evidence is telling me I don't care about. What I care about is that cloud that I'm following, that God is providing, that this goal, this mission, this path, this way is where we're supposed to be. And when it gets weird, and I promise you, it's going to get weird, be ready. Today's Samantha's first day. We haven't even begun to get weird yet. I can say it in front of her because she knows we're going down a weird path. And it's cool. We're ready for it. Listen to this passage of 1 Peter chapter 4. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. As we prepare for the promised land, we're going to need to remember there's no fear in love. Only faith. Numbers chapter 13 tells us the men had gone up with him, said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those who live in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and they look the same to them. They spread this fear among the Israelites that the promised land was too hard, too big, too much, too difficult, too scary, too weird. And then look what happens. God sends them on another lap. Take another round. Take another round. Every year there's a company, it's called Wacky Warning Labels. They hold a contest for the weirdest labels of warning on products. And I want to share a few with you that are absolutely absurd. There's one on an electric razor that, and the label says, do not use this while you're sleeping. Now, have you ever had the urge to shave while you were sleeping? Obviously, something happened that made that label necessary. There's another one that on a baby stroller that says, remove baby before folding. I don't understand how that became a problem, but apparently it was and needed to be addressed. The 2010 winner of their award, their contest award winner, was for a hands-free talking device for your car. And the warning label on that device said, do not use when driving. I'm stunned by some of these. There's one on a tractor that says, caution, avoid death. Avoid death. Now, I think that's good advice. Avoid death. But what happened on that tractor that said that they needed to warn people to avoid death? My favorite one in this list is on a fishing lure. It's a 3-pronged fishing lure. And the warning label says, warning, harmful if swallowed. Did they have a problem with people swallowing fishing lures? Or were they worried about the safety of the fish? I'm not sure, but either way, the reality was they were afraid of being sued, so they put the warning label on. Fear paralyzes them just as it does us. Fear stops us when we know we should do something and we don't. Think about this. Have you ever been sitting in a restaurant and you thought, the person sitting across from me really needs to hear that God loves them? Has that thought ever come into your mind? And then what did you do with it? Did you ignore it? Did you walk away from it? Or did you act on it? And then what happened when you decided what you were going to do? If you walk away from it, did you feel this burning inside of you all day long that you really wish you had just said something to that person? Does it nag at you? Does it cause you to wish you had done something different? Because that's what happens to me. And I realized a few years back that every time I feel that way, I get this little, what I like to call the devil on my shoulder. He says, oh, you don't want to do that. They're going to think you're crazy. They're going to think you're some kind of religious nut. And the angel on the other shoulder says, just do it. Just do it. You don't know how powerful it's going to be. Just do it. Just do it. But for a long time, the devil on the shoulder won. They're going to think you're crazy. Well, I don't want to be crazy, so I'm not going to do that. They're going to tell you to go away. Well, if they're going to tell me to go away, then I should probably just go away. Look what Numbers 14:1 tells us. That night, all of the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All of the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Wow, Moses had it right. These were stiff-necked people. If only we had died in Egypt. Okay, so let's wrap our head around this just for a moment. God provides, the people complain. The people say, we would rather have died than to have God provide. There's a dangerous, dangerous thing that happens there. Because sometimes when we complain, we get exactly what our fears are. Read this passage with me. As surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness, your bodies will fall. Every one of you, 20 years old or more, who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. How about that? Your faults of evidence appearing real, when you pronounce that, when you say that, when you allow that to control you, God just might give you what you said. If ever there was a reason to have positive thinking and positive words, this is it. What if I said, well, I don't know why we're walking around this mountain so many times, but maybe if we made one right turn instead of all these left turns, we'd be where we were supposed to be. Well, I said that as a child to my father when we were lost one time. Let me tell you, that didn't turn out well. But if you say it as an adult to God, maybe we shouldn't make all these left turns. Maybe we should make a right turn and see what you're doing over here and ask for His blessing. You might just get the opposite of what you were afraid might happen. It just might happen that way. See, their fears became their realities. See, many times I believe that we stand right at the edge of obedience to God. Right at the edge. We hang half our feet over that edge, and we maybe even lean out, and we're almost obedient. Almost obedient. You know that you can't be almost anything? It's impossible to be almost anything. My favorite example is you can't be kind of pregnant. This is either a reality or it's not. You can't kind of be, you can't almost be, you can't sort of be anything. You either are or you are not. And God calls us out over that ledge into complete obedience to Him. And when we do that, when we jump off the ledge of obedience, what we find is we find a giving, forgiving, confronting, confessing, personal growth in God. See, we need to be very careful not to let our fear of how hard it might be keep us from doing what God is calling us to do. The reality is that if we don't obey, our fears might just become our reality. When we move forward in faith, you're giving God a chance to do an amazing miracle. When you look at the reality of what you're being called to do, and you say, without God, this shall surely fail. You're opening it up. You're saying, you know what? I'm going to do this. I don't know how it's going to work out. If it fails, it was my idea. If it succeeds, it was God's. Because clearly, it won't work without Him. This is a great place to be. We have to choose patience over anger. God told Moses to speak to the rock, and Moses struck it twice. This is the burden of leadership. You know, as parents, our job isn't to change our children into compliant little people. Our job is to build them up, lead them. You know, our job as a spouse is not to change our spouse. Hello? I know I've been talking for a long time. I want to make sure I have your attention. Our job as spouse is not to change our spouse. Our job is to lead. You know, Paul says it best. He says, I don't have it right, but follow me as I follow Christ. Together, we got to get it right. Follow me as I follow Christ, and we'll get it right. Don't try to change your spouse. Don't try to be something that you can't possibly be. Don't try to do God's job. Follow Christ as closely as you can. And encourage your spouse. Encourage your neighbor. Encourage your friends. Encourage your grandchildren. Encourage your children to follow you as you follow Christ. I've had the privilege or obligation to sit in on as it's weird. I've been to AA meetings, not as a participant, but as the person to pray for the AA meetings before they start. And if you've ever been to one of these, you know where I'm going with this. They don't believe in calling out on Jesus or on God. They say higher power. And they invited me to pray there, and I said, this isn't going to end well because I'm not going to say higher power. I'm going to do what God's called me to do. And they said, well, it'll be okay if you include these words into your prayer. If you say, grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change and the courage to change the things that I can and the wisdom to know the difference, it'll be all right. I said, well, those are great words. And if God puts it on my heart at the time to say those words, I will. But I don't know. So I think AA does a lot of great work. But until you follow the creator of the universe and not the higher power, you have it wrong. And a lot of us want to mess it up. We want to make our spouse, our boyfriend, our girlfriend, we want to make them the higher power. Where God's calling us to follow Christ and let the world see that. Follow what Christ is leading you to and let the world see that. It makes a big difference. If worship is the answer and following Christ is the solution to our problems, then I'll be bold enough to say we have absolutely nothing to complain about. There's a dangerous, bold statement. We have nothing to complain about. As we look around and we say, look what God has done. Look at the privilege that He's given us to live where we live, to truly worship Him, to experience this intimacy that only God can provide. When we put that intimacy into the proper context, following Him, then He says, I will lead you, and you will be my people. There's no greater place that we can find ourselves today than to have God say of us, look at my people as they follow the path, as they follow the cloud, as they follow the fire, as they follow my Son. That's where we want to be today. Let us pray.